All right, we're going to start by going over some of the themes of the 1920s really quickly. First box, growth and influence of business. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. America refocuses on the economy, corporate growth. And what we end up seeing is that I think a lot of the laws and the policies of this time period it's kind of a reversal of the progressive era, the progressive reforms. So we're seeing less attention to workplace safety. We're seeing less attention to labor conditions. We're starting to see the kind of the rise of big corporate America again, not quite to the extent that it was under Rockefeller and Vanderbilt and J.P. Morgan and all that stuff, but really more of a pro-business stance for America. And so instead of all the progress that had been made for workers was there as a foundation, but there was less attention on labor unions. There was less attention to those working conditions. It was sort of a step backwards to the old ways of kind of laissez-faire, hands-off approach. But business culture and sort of worship of money, success, efficiency, technology is really a hallmark of the growth of business and industry. Um, President Calvin Coolidge said, the man who builds a factory builds a temple. The man who works there worships there. So it just gives you a kind of a sense of the mentality about America took a more pro-business stance during the 20s. In terms of economic issues, some of the things to be mindful of, we're going to see lower taxes on the wealthy and on corporations, which is a reversal of the progressive era as well. We're going to see more tax loopholes, which are ways to get around paying taxes. There was actually Andrew Mellon was the Secretary of the Treasury during most of the 1920s, and he was one of the richest men in America. He's one of the co-founders of Carnegie Mellon University, along with Andrew Carnegie. And Andrew Mellon actually used the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. He went to the employees and he said, I need you to draw me up a list of all of the ways that people and corporations can get around paying their income taxes. And I think that the people at the IRS thought that he was doing it to try to figure out how to better, enforce tax laws. And what he did instead was he took that list of ways to get around paying taxes and he shared them with some of the biggest corporations and wealthiest people in America. And so he was kind of, in a sense, trying to help people avoid paying their taxes instead of enforcing the collection of taxes. So that just gives you a sense of where we were at when it came to tax policy in America at the time. There's still a growing and persistent wealth gap between the rich and the poor. And we're also seeing more sort of trade protectionism, higher tariffs to protect American businesses. But it's also a way to, or I guess I'll say also related to foreign policy. Because during this time period, we were using tariffs as punishment on European countries that weren't repaying their debts to us after World War One. So the allies that owed us money after the First World War, we put high tariffs on products from their countries like France and Britain because they weren't paying their debts back to us. And so we were using tariffs not only as a way to protect American businesses, but as a way to punish foreign countries that we didn't feel were doing what they should be doing. As far as social life and culture is concerned, the 1920s is really based on entertainment and leisure culture. So popular music, movies, radio, baseball, boxing, amusement parks, like those were all part of kind of the pop culture. Really, for the first time, a real well-defined popular culture in the United States that we hadn't seen before. And a lot of it was just that, again, I think that in the context of coming out of the Spanish flu pandemic, people were just looking for opportunities to have fun and to live their lives because they had been cooped up for over a year and wanted to get back at things. But also there was a lot available. So I think part of the culture was also a very strong advertising culture. So products were sort of marketed to consumers as needed, even though they weren't really necessary all the time. And so it led to kind of an era of materialism and consumerism. And I think that the 1920s really is, in a lot of ways, a sister decade to the 1950s. When we think about the level of materialism and consumerism, that people wanted to have things and they wanted other people to see that they had them. There's just a lot of stuff to buy. There were a lot of things to spend your money on, and there were lots of easy ways to get those things because of sort of the financing that was available. So I should probably also put under the economic thing expansion of credit and buying on time or margin. When you buy on time, it basically means that you make installment payments a little at a time until you purchase whatever it is that you're buying at full price. When you buy something on margin, that usually means stocks. You're buying stock with loaned money, and the hope is that you'll make more money later on. So this leads to a speculative boom because everybody's inflating the prices of everything by kind of gambling, by speculating and hoping that home prices will go up, oil prices will go up, the price of consumer goods will go up. And people are often buying things with money that they didn't have. Modernity versus tradition. This theme is seen in multiple different ways in the 1920s. So you have the sort of rural versus urban divide. Cities are diverse, fast-paced, modern. Small towns are still basically the way they've always been. And so there's this tension between how the cities are changing and how the rural towns are staying the same. And that also has to do with immigration. It has to do with technology. It has to do with radical new political ideologies, right? Socialism and communism, union activity. Like a lot of those things were not things that people in the country were familiar with or had around them. They weren't exposed to it, and so they feared it because they didn't really get it. But some of the ways that we see this urban versus rural or modern versus traditional thing play out. Great example is the Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee. And this is sort of, this is about teaching evolution in schools, in public schools, no less, too. So public schools are supposed to be secular institutions where religion is not taught. But in a place like Tennessee, where it was mainly rural, people feared that the teaching of Darwin's theory of evolution in science classes would invalidate or push back against sort of the biblical teachings of the story of creation that they had raised their families on. And so there was this tension between, you know, people from the city, they embraced the ideas like evolution because it was scientific and it was technological and it seemed to make sense, whereas people in the country thought it was blasphemous and thought that it was immoral to teach that human beings had evolved from a common ancestor with apes, and that somehow that made us lesser, that made us more animalistic. And so you had, the lawyer that argued in favor of the teacher of John Scopes teaching evolution was Clarence Darrow, who was a big-time Chicago city lawyer. And the lawyer who argued on the side of the school district that wanted to fire Scopes for teaching evolution was William Jennings Bryan, who was a progressive, conservative candidate from the Midwest who had run for president a couple times and failed, but he was basically a biblical scholar and he was teaching about all the things in the Bible that should be most important and most emphasized. And he even favored school prayer and teaching of the Bible in school. So there's this real tension between the old ways and the new ways. In terms of technology and innovation, a lot of the stuff that we see during this time period is, technologies that make life easier more entertaining, and make communication and travel more accessible. All right, so radio, automobile, home appliances. These were kind of the big three: the radio, the automobile, and home appliances. But there were other things too. I mean, like there's one great example of, and this is a great way where the technology and the advertising come together. Listerine mouthwash had an ad campaign where they invented something called halitosis, which is basically it's an invented medical condition for bad breath, and that the only thing that would prevent halitosis is if you use Listerine. And they talked about how there would be social consequences if you went to a party and you talked to someone and you had bad breath. But luckily, you don't have to fall into that category because we have this new product that'll solve it, Listerine. So that's the kind of marketing and technology and packaging all of these things together. But radios, Ford's Model T, first the Model A, but the Model T Ford, they were affordable to the average American family. They were mass produced, so they were cheap, but they were also reliable. And so the automobile completely transforms American life because it allows people to have more mobility. You can get from the city to the suburbs to the country very easily. People start moving out of the cities into suburbs because now they have an automobile that will allow them to commute to work but live somewhere else. And that actually has some social ramifications too, because what we end up seeing as a result of the automobile is the development of mainly white suburbs. And this phenomenon is known as white flight, because white people are fleeing the cities, and the only people who are staying behind in the cities tend to be poor immigrants and minority groups, racial or ethnic minority groups. And so we see kind of this segregation taking place as the result of the development of the automobile. It's an unintended consequence socially. All right, prohibition. We know that the temperance movement had been strong in America for a long time, so the temperance movement finally wins, but it's a failed experiment because the federal government bans the sale, production, and possession of alcohol nationwide, but it's very hard to enforce, right? Hard to enforce because people are drinking in the privacy of their own homes. They're producing their own alcohol, which is often unsafe because it's unregulated. They're smuggling it, right? Bootleggers and smugglers are getting the alcohol from other countries where it's legal and smuggling it into the United States. And so the value of it actually goes up. You have organized crime that starts to develop to protect the black market trade of alcohol. You have the development of speakeasies, which are illegal bars and nightclubs. And so like massive amounts of people are just flaunting the drinking of alcohol. They're going against prohibition, and it was a rule that like so many people didn't like that was impossible to keep it in place. So much so that even high-ranking politicians were breaking prohibition's rules. President Warren G. Harding had a house on K Street in Washington D.C., which was almost kind of like a man cave slash frat house. And he would go and play poker there a couple times a week with his buddies, and they would drink bootlegged illegal alcohol. The president of the United States during Prohibition was drinking bootlegged alcohol. So that just gives you a sense of like how this was something that, although it seemed like a moral victory on the surface, it really didn't work. And after about a decade to 12 years of the experiment of prohibition, it was finally repealed. And so the 18th Amendment, this is interesting. The 18th Amendment the 18th Amendment prohibits alcohol. And then the 21st Amendment repeals the 18th Amendment. And what's interesting about that is that 18 and 21 are the only two legal drinking ages that we've ever had in the United States. They dropped it down to 18 during the Vietnam War because the argument was made that if I can go to war and die defending the rights of my freedom and the rights of my country, I'm not even old enough to have a drink, but I can die for my country. What's up with that? voting also in some places had been 21. And so the idea was if I can't even vote for the politicians who are going to send me off to war, what kind of a country is that? So they dropped everything to 18 during Vietnam. And then when the war was over, they actually bumped it back up to 21. Right? So it just gives you a sense of the amendments there. Really quickly, changing role and image of women. Obviously, 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote nationwide, which is huge. They've been fighting for that for over a century. But also, women are becoming more outspoken, more daring, more promiscuous. Hello. And more fashion conscious. So we get this image of the flapper, which is a kind of sexually expressive young woman who smokes and drinks and socializes with lots of different people, including lots of different men. She may have casual relationships with different people. She's not really interested in settling down and getting married and having a family. And so just women being able to express themselves more openly and not being told, sit still and look pretty and stay in the corner and keep quiet, or go home and tend to the children. Women were just feeling like they had more freedom and more opportunities to express themselves openly. And trust me, not everybody was happy about this. Especially in rural America, people thought it was immoral that women were wearing more revealing clothing and were smoking and drinking and sleeping around, and that just wasn't a good trend. So that was certainly a major thing, but then there was still this pressure in the background of women expecting at some point to settle down and have a family. Immigration and race relations, obviously some continuities here. We're going to have continued segregation. We're going to see a resurgence of the KKK, not only in the South, but even in the North. It's going to spread to places it's never spread before. We're going to see a record number of lynchings across the South. But then on the immigrant front, we're also going to see major resistance to immigration. We're going to see the KKK actually turns against Catholics and Jews during this time period, not just black people, but Catholics and Jews as well. The temperance movement itself, banning alcohol, prohibiting alcohol, was partially related to xenophobia and nativism, because there was this sense that Catholics and Jews culturally would use wine as part of their religious and cultural ceremonies. Especially in the Catholic Mass, you use wine to represent the body of Christ. And the feeling was that if we banned alcohol, then the Catholics would stop coming to America, and that would be a way to curb immigration. What ended up happening instead is just that everybody started drinking alcohol legally, and it actually encouraged more immigration and the beginnings of sort of the Italian mafia taking over in the United States of the bootlegging industry. So that backfired. But we also see sort of caps and quotas being put in place on immigration. The 1924 National Origins Act puts really, really strict caps on immigration for really the first time in American history, where we're saying this is the total number we'll allow in each year for immigrants, and we're only going to allow a certain percentage of each ethnic group or each nationality to come in. And that really slams the door on the waves of immigrants that had been coming in since the 1880s. And then there's also kind of some this what we call the first Red Scare, and this is a fear of more radical, anarchistic, communist, Marxist, socialist influence in America. And this is, of course, coming on the heels of the Russian Revolution and the formation of the Soviet Union at the end of the First World War. There's this fear that somehow those ideas are going to come and infiltrate America. And so there's a lot, the FBI gets really involved in cracking down on so-called communists and anarchists. And this is the first Red Scare. We'll see the second Red Scare happen in the post-World War II era during the Cold War. Okay, finally, government and politics. You have three presidents during this time period. You have Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, and they are really one big administration because Harding died in office of a heart attack. He had Coolidge and Hoover in his administration. Coolidge was his vice president, Hoover was his secretary of commerce. And so over time, really what we see is the policy decisions of the Harding administration just being played out over a decade. So they all had basically the same political and economic policies. They all believed that a hands-off approach to government was the best. So kind of a return to laissez-faire. Encourage growth of business through lowering taxes and raising tariffs. And none of them, not even Hoover, in the midst of the stock market collapsing, believed that there was an awful lot that the government could or should do in politics. And so, Harding touted after the war was over a, quote, return to normalcy, which actually wasn't really a word, he kind of made it up, but a return to normalcy. And what that really meant was a return to conservative values, a return to laissez-faire, an end to the progressive era of reform, maybe even hinting at a return to more segregation and fewer rights for African Americans and minorities. But the idea was to just keep taxes low, to keep government out of people's affairs, and to allow business to boom. But these guys didn't do a whole lot to intervene on social issues either. So racism and discrimination and violence were kind of left unchecked during this time period. And so it was a conservative 10-year period that was a response to a very liberal 20-year period of progressive reform. And as I told you guys before, we don't like to get stuck in one rut for too long as Americans. We kind of like that pendulum to swing back and forth politically. So if we're going to have a couple decades of major reforms and change, we're going to probably need a decade to cool off and to go back to, step away from a lot of that reform and change. So hopefully that gives you some ideas of kind of the themes that you should have had in your 1920s chart.